Good morning, everyone. Usually when I turn to the altar like that, I'm praying for inspiration and I'm praying that words and ideas come through me that you all need to hear. Today, my prayer was much more simple. It was for my voice in your hearing. I'm in a little battle with the virus here. Energetically, I think I'm winning, but it got the best of my throat, so bear with me. This is a really fascinating reading. Somehow I think it comes to me every year, at least that's what I was thinking yesterday. And often I find myself getting up here and wanting to soften the story. I always think, gee, there might be some new people here, and what are they going to think? This is a terrible reading. They listen to Jesus, and it sounds like he's turning everybody against everybody else. So I try and come up, quiet voice, easy, deliver a nice message. Last night I was thinking, Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. And when he delivered this message, he was really trying to light a fire of devotion in people. There was no mistake about what he was doing with this reading. It's challenging. Of course, Swamiji helps us a lot by explaining it for us. I'm not sure what I would do with it if I was left to my own devices with it. But still, it's a strong reading, and I couldn't help last night but realize how it reminded me, at least, if not even being analogous, of the story in the Bhagavad Gita, which we all know, and I won't spend a lot of time here, but Krishna, of course, is talking to Arjuna, and basically, in the story, he's telling him that he has to kill his cousins. And Arjuna wants no part of it. He throws down his bow and arrow. He's not going to do this. And you realize that what's being asked of him, well, we've always known what's being asked of him is hard because the cousins, of course, represent those qualities in ourself that represent our ego. And Krishna is saying to Arjuna, what are you going to do? You have no choice. You cannot keep holding on to your ego. You have to move towards soul consciousness. And that means that you have to kill these qualities. But I realized last night, it doesn't happen in the Gita by Krishna saying to Arjuna, you're going to have to give up your beautiful home. You're going to have to give up all of your bows and arrows. You're going to have to give up things that might have been very dear to Krishna. But rather, he says, you have to let go of your family. That which we hold so near and dear to us, always. This was really a big test for Arjuna, and pointedly so, by the way that the story is told. And the sword, of course, is an apt image here because Jesus is saying to us, this is going to be hard work. This is going to require a sword of great discrimination to make choices, positive choices that move you in the right direction. Now, what Yogananda told us later is that in his incarnation as Arjuna, he was liberated then. That's a very powerful point here, to hear how hard the test was for him. And by meeting that test, which of course he did, he attained final soul liberation. Last week, Helen gave a really wonderful sermon. Of course, I don't know how many of you were here or how many of you listened. I would suggest that you all listen to it. It was lovely, and of course, I will not give her sermon again, but just to bring you up to date to my sermon, she talked about an experience that she had in a pilgrimage that many of us took to Italy last summer. And she described going to the town of Cortona, her experience in getting to know St. Marguerite, I think better than she said she had. She hadn't known much about her. And then she described an experience that she had in a museum that about half of our group went to. She didn't mention that that little museum, which was hard to find, it was a tiny little museum. It had maybe 40 or 50 pieces of art in it at most. I don't know. And she described her experience with Frau Angelico's painting of the Annunciation. And she spoke of it beautifully, and she spoke about the artist not just being an artist, but being a mystic, so that she had the experience she knew in the moment as she was looking at this painting, which was an inspired painting. It didn't come from the artist. It came through the artist, right from God. And she said she knew then that her life would be changed forever. It was very compelling and profound talk and sharing of a personal experience. Well, I was there in that museum with Helen, and I have to say I didn't think to myself that my life would be different from that moment on, but I will tell you that I never looked at any other piece of art in that museum. Not that there was a lot of it, but I stepped up in front of that painting of the Annunciation, and I never moved. It was absolutely exquisite. I don't think that I ever really cognized exactly what Helen said, that it was the inspiration that had come through the artist that was grabbing me the way it did. But I was remembering that in Laverna, which is another place we visited, there is another artist, Della Robbia's work. He does it in glazed terracotta of the Annunciation. Now, what Helen said about that painting, if I got it right, is she spoke about Mary as being in a receptive pose, as being ready. She spoke about how special that soul would have had to be asked to deliver the Son of God to the rest of the world. And she spoke about the discussion, which was not out loud, of course, that the archangel and Mary had, and how Mary said, in essence, thy will be done. God's will be done. I was reminded of of this Della Robbia piece that's in Laverna, which is a very sacred spot up in the hills of Umbria, where Francis received the stigmata for the first time. So everything at Laverna, every square inch of ground there, and Francis spent much of the last many years of his life there, has this it's a sacred quality. You feel it everywhere you are. Before I went in to see Della Robbia's Annunciation, Jyotish and Devi, who were with us at that time, this was now several years ago, not just last summer, said to a group of us that the first time they went there, one of the older monks had taken them aside and said to them, when you stand in front of this piece, look at the look on Mary's face. They said he managed to catch perfectly that moment where the archangel was saying to her, you've been chosen to bring the Son of God onto this earth. And he said, you see in her face that moment where he said, asking herself, can I do this? Do I have it in me? And then, of course, the archangel says to her, this is God's will. And then at that point, so the story's told, she says, God's will be done then. She accepts it. But for me, I saw in Mary, in the Della Robbia, that moment of wonder, that moment where you think, where any human, she was of course a human, a highly evolved human, highly spiritually evolved, but would have to stop for a moment and be with it until the angel said to her, this is God's will. Then what happens? Then it takes the courage of her conviction, which really means that awareness of God's will, that awareness of the inspiration, that it's beyond what we're choosing to do, what we're trying to do. It's not, can I do this? It's, this is what God is asking of me, and he will do it through me. And it's so beautiful seeing how that is captured in that Della Robbia piece, that even the great saints had to come up with great courage. They might not call it that. So many stories flooded into my mind last night. I've read a book. I go back to it many times. I don't read it front to cover, but I've read a lot of it, called Talks with Great Composers, by a man whose last name is Arbel. And it's a wonderful book. It's an account of a conversation that he had first with Brahms in the late 1800s. That's how the book opens. But really, it's an exact translation of his talks with many great composers. He chose composers that he knew were inspired. And when you read these words of Brahms, I'm going to share with you now, but of all of the composers and all of the people that Brahms alludes to, not just composers, he talks a lot about Beethoven, he talks about Haydn, he mentions the people, Mozart, who he knows were composing from an inspired place, not just writing their own music. And he actually says, here are pieces that people are loving now, but 50 years from now, nobody will even know they were written because they're not inspired. And it's, my point today is not to share the whole book with you. I would love to inspire you to read it, but he talks so much about what it means to have inspiration flowing through you and to have the courage to live with that inspiration because you know without a doubt that it's God coming through you. He wouldn't let this man publish his conversation for 50 years. The author was sort of aghast at that, but he asked them, why is that true? He said, there is no way that the world will be ready for my work until 50 years from now. It reminded me of Master and some of his predictions of people that would be affected by his Gita and of creating small communities, but not right then, in the future. Brahms knew this. He said to this author, he said, I'm putting new wine into old bottles, and the Philistines will have none of it. That's what he said in that moment. There's no way this is going to go down right now. The world at this time, in the late 1800s, is not ready for this inspiration. He said, my violin concerto is a symphony. Everybody will know that. He never doubted it. Do you know his violin concerto was rejected so completely that when many other great violinists were invited to play around the world, they would be invited with the condition that they would not play Brahms' violin concerto. And he knew that. What is that? One has to think it was certainly not about the music. It had to do with who was ready for what inspiration to flow. There's one more wonderful story in there that Brahms is telling on Beethoven, because of course Beethoven's gone, but where a concertmaster comes to Beethoven, concertmaster, the first violinist in an orchestra, and yells at him. He says to him, your violin concerto is next to impossible for anybody's left hand. And Brahms said Beethoven shrieked at him, and he said to him, when I composed that piece, I knew without a doubt that I was having an experience with God himself Do you think I was worried about your puny little fiddle? You think I would even consider that? He spoke about Beethoven like he was pretty much of a maniac, but I really got to see the part of what was riding through Beethoven was he was saying, make no mistake about it, folks, I'm channeling here. You deal with it. You do whatever you have to do to get your fingers to work they need to work. This is God speaking to you. I read a book not that long ago called The Invention of Wings. Really beautiful book. It's a historical fiction piece about the early 1800s, but it was very, very well researched. I mean, everybody who reviewed the book said, so it's really very much like reading history. It's a book that was written by Sue Monk Kidd. And I wish last night I had the book, but I've passed it on because there was a paragraph in there that I would have loved to have quoted for you. But it's the story of Sarah and Nina Grimke. Now, I'm embarrassed to say I had never heard of them before, but these are sisters who were born into great wealth in South Carolina and who really were right at the forefront of the abolitionist and women's movement. This is the early 1800s. When I think about what these two women did, I was living in the 60s, and I was still marching for women's rights. Can you imagine what it was like? And we were still having food hurled at us and everything else. We're still fighting for women's rights in a certain way. Never mind the racial situation in our country and around the world. This was in the early 1800s, born onto one of the wealthiest plantations. And as was the custom, when Sarah was 11 years old, her parents gave her a slave, Hedda. This is a true story. Hedda was a real woman, as was everybody. Sarah was so appalled with the notion of slavery that she would not accept the slave. But it created mayhem in the house. That was it. I mean, she was never accepted again. She loved to read and study. When they found out that she was privately teaching Hedda to read, they locked the library. She was never allowed in. She went on, obviously she and her sister, to do great things, but she lived her whole life in fear, and she always felt victimized. Sarah, the white woman. Hedda, the slave, never felt that. She felt inspired by God. God used to talk to her all the time. He would tell her how to protect herself, and she would go out with the courage of her conviction and do that, because that's what happens. That's what true courage is. When it's coming so clearly from God that you wouldn't call it courage. You're so connected to the divine. She one time said to Sarah, this is all from diaries, this is all true. She said, I'm a free woman, Sarah, and you are not. You are bound by your mind and your fears, and I'm free, filled with hope and courage. It's so beautiful. I'm sharing these stories of you, not just to talk about the saints. We could talk about St. Francis, St. Marguerite, as Helen did last year, St. Catherine, who when she was 6 years old, to make her point, because her parents did not want her praying all the time, talking to God all the time, she just cut all her hair off. Because in those days, you were unmarriageable if you cut your hair off. These people who knew without a doubt that God was trying to work through them, but so many people, and then look at our own path. Look at Swami Kriyananda. Swami Kriyananda would probably never refer to himself as having great courage. I was reading a couple of weeks ago, just by chance, I don't know why, a little bit from Faith is My Armor, which is the book that Davy wrote about Swami's life. And there's a chapter in there about when Swamiji first tried to build a dome out at the meditation retreat. First piece of land, first place that was Ananda. He had to build himself a home. A friend said, oh, I just read about this in Popular Mechanic or some magazine like that. So Swami thought, how hard could this be? So he buys his little pieces of wood, makes them into triangle, covers them with plastic, gets it all the way up. They're about to put the last triangle up, and the whole thing comes crashing down. He then tries a second time. He says, I've got to be able to get stronger wood, builds it. Same thing happens. First big wind that comes through brings the whole thing down. Then Swami says, he was still not to be dissuaded. He says, I'm going to put this wood together with metal, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't crash down. Well, he was right. It didn't. But the first wind that came picked it up and carried it away. Swami was teaching in San Francisco. He comes back, and as Davy says, or maybe Swami said, and pieces of the dome were artistically laid over bushes all around. So, what does Swami do? He sits down on the plank that was the base for his dome, the dome that never was, and he says, much to my surprise, I had the most beautiful, deep meditation. You know, what is this? This man who never stopped, ousted by SRF, knew what he was meant to do, against all odds. So many people against him, so many physical ailments. What happened when a doctor said to him, how's your health? He said, excellent. And then he starts listing all the surgeries, all the medical conditions, all the pills he's on. Excellent. I'm in great health. What is that? He wouldn't call it courage. He thinks he's just doing what God asked him to do. But this takes courage. This story that we hear about Master, now Master was an avatar, and probably none of us can really know if Master had to grow into anything or if he just had every experience in life so we could learn from it. But it doesn't matter. The story is saying to us, this is what courage looks like. And if your brother gets you and brings you back, you know, we just call that kind of this aspect of consciousness that would do anything to hold us in the material world. It's a true force of consciousness. It wants us to stay in our ego, but it doesn't with these pleasant familiarities. So it's so subtle, you don't know. You have children, you're involved with them, then you have grandchildren, you're involved with them. Then you're just thinking to meditate one time, but friends call you and say, hey, we're just going to go out to this movie. Or you turn on your television at night and you watch a movie that just leaves you feeling tense and anxious to the core. Pleasant familiarities, everybody does it. Who would think not to do these things? Master referred to it, as Swamiji said here, as Amar being drawn into the familial warmth. But what is that? It's just things that we're used to that just, if we don't stay very conscious, take us away from our spiritual search, from our spiritual quest. You know, when Swami expounds on this reading in Rays of the Same Light, it's very short. It's 2 pages long, very unusual for him. But in that 2 pages are so many words, strong words, that start with consonants. You know how they're stronger? Courage, determination, discrimination, willpower. I can't remember right now. All these words. He's saying that's what we're talking about here. We're saying this is what we need to bring to our search as spiritual aspirants. It's not going to come easy. There are too many things that will pull us away. And that every experience that we're having in life, everything. Yesterday I gave a 3-hour seminar on death and dying. It was such a wonderful thing for me to do. I just, you know, those moments where I didn't read anything new, I didn't listen to anything new, but I got it in a way I've never got it. That every single moment of our lives, every thought that we have, every word that we speak, every piece of music that we listen to, every movie we see, every relationship we form, everything, it can't be too small, is getting us ready for that moment when we leave this body, getting us ready for that moment when our test will come, like it did to Arjuna, where we have to say, okay, what are we going to do now? Are we going to choose to stay with the ego because it's so pleasantly familiar and it just looks so natural? Or are we going to follow the light, look for ways to move towards soul consciousness, not ego consciousness? You know, the very last almost stanzas of the Bhagavad Gita are so dear. First, there's the one that we all know because it's one of our readings, where Krishna says to Arjuna, always choose the higher dharma, the higher duty. If you do, he says, I will always be there to support you, always. Even if you're having to let go of another duty that was meaningful and important, a commitment you made, whatever it was. A dharma ceases to be a dharma if it's basically superseded by a higher dharma. Then he says, I will be here. He says, I've told you everything I can tell you, Arjuna. I've told you the what, why, where of the spiritual path. 700 or so stanzas of the Gita with Krishna just espousing these truths. Then he looks at Arjuna. It's so incredibly touching. And he says, listen to this, take it in, and then do as you feel. So in the end, he's saying, you do what you can do. You take your next step. We're talking about determination, discrimination, commitment. We're not saying do more than you can do. We're saying if you look to the light, you will get help. And that's what Krishna's saying. If you reach for a higher dharma, I'll be there. I listened to a talk that Asha gave just this past week, and I heard a story. Maybe everybody else has heard it, but I hadn't heard it, as Asha's so want to do. It's from the Reader's Digest. I used to make fun of my mother for reading the Reader's Digest, but now I'm beginning to think it was a great work. And there's a story in there about a woman who tried to commit suicide. And she had a near-death experience. So she wrote a book about that. And this story in Reader's Digest is about this book. She says when she died, when she left her body, she went to a very dark place. It was dark. There was nothing but black and gray there. All of the beings were dressed in black and gray, and they were all hunched over and looking down the whole time. The woman who wrote the story said it was just a horrible experience. She started to think to herself, have this thought. I don't know what the thought was like because she was dead, but what did I do? What did I do? And then something compelled her to look up. And she looked up and she saw an enormous light. And that light was a huge group of angels trying to get all these souls' attention, trying to call to them, trying to reach down for them. But they were all looking down. None of them could look up except her. And as soon as she looked up, the angels came and got her. She was back in her body. This is a true story. And she lived. And this is what Krishna is saying to Arjuna. I will always be there to help you. So in the end, what is our job? Our job is not just to get ourselves onto this path. Our job is to live the superconscious living exercises that Master gave us. When we say, I am positive, energetic, enthusiastic, we mean it. That's how we have to go after this search, this path that we're on to move towards soul consciousness with all the energy we can find. We cannot be lackluster. Nothing that Swamiji did or Master did or Brahms did or the Grimke sisters, these people were not lackluster. They were enthusiastically, positively, with all the energy, and in most cases, all the joy, because it was joy. That's what happens when you're communing with the divine. You are joy. That is how we have to move down this path. That's what our goal is. And then, just like Swamiji, he quotes Jesus, like Jesus says in this reading, he that findeth his life will lose it. And he that loseth his life, ego, in my name, for my sake, meaning because they're moving towards God, not just for any old reason. All of these teachings apply when we're looking to grow spiritually, he that loseth his life for my sake will find it. Meaning, turn towards the light. They're waiting to help us. And then I can end exactly as Helen ended her sermon last week when she said what the angel said to Mary. With God, everything is possible.